All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to officially kick this all off by saying welcome, everyone. My name is Jody King, and I'm with the Alaska Procurement Technical Assistance Center. And I want to welcome today our guest speaker, Chris Pobieglo from Business Insurance Associates. And Chris, I'm showing that you're still muted or that you lost your mic. So if you want to just chime back in, that would be great. So while we're waiting for, yay! Oh, good. Okay, thanks. So
some technical difficulties.
Yeah, no matter how much you practice, those technical difficulties still kind of pop up. But while we're letting Chris get that all resolved, what I'd like to do is go ahead and start off with a few housekeeping rules, just how to use the GoToWebinar panel. A few things to call to your attention. So one of the things that I'd like to show is in the GoToWebinar panel, as you know, when you first log in, you're muted. And we really do want to encourage questions and comments and try to get as close to that feeling of being in the room together as possible. So a couple of different ways you can add your questions or comments. One, you can click on the question box and type your comments in there. Or if you're on a mobile device or it's just complex, hard to type at the moment, you can also click on that raise hand feature, and then we'll be glad to call on you, and I can unmute you from this side, and feel free to go ahead and ask your question. So two different ways, and again, we really want to encourage you all to engage. We've got a fabulous speaker with a lot of history and a lot of experience, and we really want you to leave with great information today. The next thing I want to pull to your attention is in the handouts box on the GoToWebinar panel. I have uploaded the slides for today's presentation, so you can download those. Again, if you're on a mobile device or you're just having difficulties getting that to download, you're welcome to reply to my webinar invitation and ask for the handouts, and I'll be glad to send those to you. So let me do a brief introduction about Ptac, just in case there's a few of you that aren't as familiar with our program, because unfortunately, Ptac is one of those best kept secrets, and that is so very much not our goal. We really want everyone to know us and know that we're here for you. So Ptac, or the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, we are a not-for-profit grant-funded agency. We're funded by the Defense Logistics Agency, and we're in process of our grant being moved under the Department of Defense, under the Office of Small Business Practices, I believe, trying to remember the new acronym. But what that means for you is we are a federally funded program. We're hosted here at the state of Alaska. But the takeaway for you all is that Ptac provides free assistance with all aspects of government contracting, from cradle to grave, start to finish, for federal, state, and local purchasing activity. So not only all of the federal agencies, but for state, Municipality of Anchorage, University of Alaska, City of Wasilla, Kenai Peninsula Borough. So any of that governmental contracting activity, Ptac can provide free assistance. And we do so by setting up one-on-one appointments. We have free workshops. Occasionally, we might have a special event that has a lower fee, but we try to keep all of this accessible to you and free. Alaska Ptac is one of 90 plus other Ptacs across the US. There's a Ptac in Puerto Rico and Guam. So if ever you're looking at expanding into a different geographic region, or if you have offices in another state, you can go to the second web link there, that aptac-us.org, and see a list of all the Ptacs nationwide. So we're here to help, so absolutely. Just a bit about us. So take away from this slide, Ptac's free help, and if you get stuck with something, give us a call and see what we can do for you. So my little 2 cents is over. Contact information, but what I'd like to do now is, Chris, if you're ready to go, I'd like to go ahead and make you presenter. No worries. So one of the things that Ptac's doing, we have some great activities coming up in February. For those of you signing up today's webinar, we should have those on our website for you to sign up by the end of today. But a couple of activities coming up. For those of you in the construction activity, the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, is going to have an industry day, and that's going to be February 9th. I'm currently working with the Forest Service, and we should have all of the posted information up, I would say probably beginning of next week, and that will be posted on Contract Opportunities. So they're doing an industry day. There's going to be quite a bit of construction projects, pre-commercial thinning, and that's for both the Chugach National Forest and the Tongass. So keep an eye out for that. That'll, like I said, again, once that posting is live in Contract Opportunities under that request for information, then Ptac will post that link and registration link on our website as well, but it does have to go up in Contract Opportunities first, which is kind of timely. It rolls right into the next webinar that we're going to do on responding to sources sought and request for information. And that webinar is going to be on February 16th. And that, again, should be posted on our website by the end of today. A lot of great tips and tricks on how to respond when the agency is requesting that information so that you can really make your response shine, that you can really stand out from the crowd. So good tips on that. On February 17th, we have Matt Schoonover, a great attorney out of Kansas, that is doing a webinar on how to avoid affiliation. And he presented that same package to us at our National Association conference, and it was amazing. I picked up quite a bit. So that'll be a free webinar. Again, that's February 17th. And I really encourage you to check that out as well. And again, that'll be on our website. Should be up there by the end of today. Ready, Chris?
Jody, can you put the slides up? I'm having a technical issue here, and I'll just tell you when to forward them.
Sure.
My name's Chris Pobieglo. I'm the president and commercial insurance and surety broker at Business Insurance Associates in Anchorage. I'm looking out my window over beautiful snowy Abbott Road right now here in Southeast Anchorage. And I'm really excited to be here, and I love supporting Ptac and doing these kind of things for them. We haven't done a lot of them over the last couple of years with, COVID and everything in the world, and certainly haven't done very much in-person meetings. So we've probably all become a little more adept at using technology, except for me in this case where I can't pull my slides up, but that's okay. We've done a lot of different things for Ptacs, and one of the classes that we always get a lot of questions or requests for is the bonding part of it. There's not a ton of information out there in the public sector. We've done 4-hour in-person workshops on bonding before, where we really drill down into the financial part of it, and a lot of those. Today we have about an hour and a half, somewhere in there, so we'll cover some things. But one of the things that always comes up, and I've been doing this for 26 years now, one of the things that always comes up is with the bonding is how do you grow a bonding program? How do you build it? What are some of the considerations and things that you should be thinking about along the way? Relationships are huge. That should never be discounted or not given the proper place that it has in this equation, because relationships matter, and that's a relationship with your insurance agent, relationship with your bonding broker, relationship with your surety company and your surety underwriter, relationship with your banker, a relationship with your financial people, your accountants, your CPAs. All of those things are going to be important, and so we're going to talk about some of those today. If anybody has any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. I don't want people to hold questions until the very end, and so please ask away if you have things as we come up, and we'll just kind of go through talking a little bit about how you do this. Just a little bit more about me. I'm a certified insurance counselor, a CIC. I'm a member of the NASBP, the National Association of Surety Bond Producers. They're a great source of information. I'm a member of the local Alaska Last Frontier chapter of CFMA, which is the Construction Financial Management Association. And if you're not familiar with that and you have any vested interest in doing finance and accounting within the construction industry, I'd encourage you to reach out to them. I know some of the folks over at Ptac have come to some of our meetings and different things we have like that. And a lot of it is just really free education and just making connections with people that you need to build and grow your company. So Jody, if you want to forward that first slide here, we'll get talking a little bit about this. That's me. You can forward past that. Okay, so one of the big questions we have is, why do I want to increase bonding capacity? Most people know that, if you're doing government contracting, the Miller Act says that any project over $100,000, you have to bond with performance payment bonds and, of course, bid bonds when you bid them. And the reason is they're protecting taxpayer dollars. You don't want taxpayer dollars funding a project, and then you have unqualified contractors going out there to do them, and they end up defaulting, and taxpayer dollars are lost in that process. So the Miller Act basically says anything over $100,000, you have to bond. Now, that is a federal government act, but a lot of other local municipalities, local boroughs have adopted that same principle, where if you are bidding a job over $100,000, you're going to have to bond it. And a lot of general contractors in some cases might require their subcontractors bond back, and that threshold, can be different. It can depend upon the size of your subcontract. It can depend upon the critical nature of what your scope of work is compared to the overall project. And it's a way a general contractor can protect themselves. Some cases we see where a general may require a bond for the first couple jobs you do for them because you're not super familiar to them. And then maybe after a while, if you have that familiarity, they become more comfortable with the situation and don't require you bond your subcontracts back anymore. There are other entities out there too that require you bond jobs under 100,000. Now that's not the standard, but there are ones out there. I believe like Cook Inlet Housing and Alaska Housing Finance, I believe they require you would have to bond a $50,000 job. And so the main thing is just to understand what the requirements are. And if you are going to be pursuing government contracts and commercial work and potentially subcontract opportunities, you may have to bond these jobs. And so that's what this is all about, is how does that happen? Because we have a lot of guys who sometimes will be in business for 10 or 15 years and they might not have to bond anything, and then all of a sudden they do. And then we have other companies who are starting out, want to grow, and this is a consideration for them. So why do I want to increase bonding capacity? That's an important question. I've had people sit down and go, well, I want to be able to bond $5 million jobs right out of the gate. Okay, well, what is your plan for that? There has to be more to it than just what do I want. If I say to you, how much bonding capacity do you need or do you want to pursue, and set up a plan to pursue that, and you say as much as I can get, I mean, I get it. That's kind of a generic answer, but it also is kind of a signal to me that there's not so much of a plan in place. We're just taking a shotgun approach and trying to get anything we can. And so it's important to plan and to work with your broker and figure that out. Joe, do you want to forward the next slide? And these are some of the key questions that we'll answer. And the second one is increased bonding consistent with my strategic goals and business plan? It's good that if you're a surety broker, your surety underwriters, if they're in on what your plans are, if they're privy to what type of work you're pursuing, what size contracts you're pursuing, all of these things that would fit within a strategic goal, and making sure that, if you're looking at increasing your bonding, that it's consistent with the rest of the goals and the objectives of your organization too. Jody, you can forward the next one. Am I prepared to assume more risk? Obviously, I think most people look at, being able to secure bonding and maybe being able to grow their bonding capacity as an opportunity to open up new opportunities for their business where they can bid. And obviously everyone's in this to generate revenue and ultimately profits for the shareholders in the company. But the other piece to that too is are you prepared to assume more risk? Because obviously a lot of times if you're used to doing a $500,000 job and now you're going to be pursuing $5 million jobs, you have more risk at stake there. In most cases, owners of these construction companies are personally indemnified on these bonds, which means basically your personal assets are at stake. When someone goes out and does a road construction and the owner is personally indemnified and something goes sideways, that has financial implications for that owner. And in some cases, they can be tremendous financial implications. And so you have to ask yourself that question: am I prepared to assume more risk? You can go to the next one, Jody. And then, have I developed all the systems necessary to support the growth? Increasing your bonding capacity, getting a bonding program set up, increasing your bonding capacity is a lot more than just what you want to see happen. There's a lot of things that have to happen. I think everyone would agree that, a company doing $500,000 in revenue a year has different challenges than a company doing $30 million in revenue a year. And so there's a lot of things that have to grow along with this, and we'll talk a little bit about these. We'll hit each of these points a little bit more, but this is just kind of a quick overview for you about what, as a surety broker, what I think are some of the key questions that contractors should be asking them when they're looking to grow and when they're looking to get a program set up. Joe, you can go to the next one. Okay, so back to question one: have I developed all the systems necessary to support this growth? Next slide. Okay, so one of the main ones is your accounting systems and controls. Now, there's a lot of different underwriting that goes into surety depending on what you're pursuing. Most cases these days, a guy with decent personal credit, he can bond up to a $500,000 job without having to provide financial statements or a lot of financial information, business plans, things like that. So you can usually run up to a $500,000 on just personal credit, and you don't have to get into some of these more advanced financial presentations to your bonding company. When you go over a $500,000, that's where most of the bonding companies want to see financial statements, and that typically consists of a balance sheet, an income statement, a schedule of your ARs. You can use an in-house financial statement as long as it's quality and credible. And believe me, we've seen all kinds of different in-house financial statements. But if your financial statement is done in-house, you can usually use that. These days, up to $1.2 million, $1.5 million in some cases. If you have a high quality financial statement, you can provide this financial data from the surety. And usually when you provide it to them, you're talking about doing a fiscal year end financial statement for them and then likely having to update it throughout the year, maybe provide them work in progress schedules so they can track all of your financial data and have a good idea of the financial condition of your company, because this is somebody who we're asking to put up a financial guarantee on behalf of. Some of the underwriting would be very similar to what you'd go through if you went in and applied for a bank loan. If you would have a tough time getting a $1 million bank loan, you might have a challenge, getting $1 million in bonding. So there's some similarities in the underwriting. But then once you start getting over $1.5 million in terms of job size, that's where the surety companies all want to see you have a Cpa reviewed statement. Now, there's different levels of, we call them levels of assurance on the financial statements. Like I said, obviously on the lower end, you have internal financial statements. In some cases, those may be produced on something like QuickBooks if you're a beginning contractor, or if you're growing, you may still be using QuickBooks. And in the bonding industry, the underwriters call that fraud books, because you can basically make those financial statements say whatever you want. That's not to say they don't have a purpose and that anything bad about QuickBooks. It has a time and place, but it may not be the best accounting system for your company, particularly if you're looking to bond stuff over like, $1 million. You definitely have to take some additional steps to do things. So we're growing the accounting systems and controls. After the in-house statement, then you have a CPA compiled statement. And typically all this is a CPA takes your internal financial statements, puts them together in a fancy cover, and provides those back. They don't typically offer any kind of level of assurance beyond just really a beautified internal financial statement. And so because of that, they have kind of limited value, I'd say. But then after that, the next level up you have is the CPA Reviewed. And that's where the CPA actually does go through and run tests and make sure that all the information is credible, and they offer a cover letter on there saying that they've reviewed it and that everything is consistent with accounting best practices. And after that, you have a full-blown CPA audit. Obviously these things have a price tag involved for the person who's doing them. So like a CPA Reviewed might cost you anywhere from, $8,000 to $20,000 a year. And then of course, audits can be a much more expensive process than that. So the CPA Reviewed is really where you want to look at being if you're looking at bonding jobs over $1 million. There's no substitute for it. It's a cost to you, but it's also an investment in your company and an investment in your bond program. And that way you also have a CPA at your disposal. Always recommend that contractors work with CPAs who are well familiar with construction accounting and with construction. So maybe not all CPAs would be the best option. So if you do get to a point where you're looking for CPAs, get referrals, or look up and see which CPAs are involved in the various construction trade industries at AGC, at CFMA, some of those. But that's an important piece of growing your bonding capacity, is that you're going to have to develop these accounting processes along the way. You can't do accounting doing $10 million in revenue a year the same way that you did accounting when you only did $10,000 a year. So keep that. Next slide, Jody. One of the other areas that you want to ask yourself if you're looking to grow is, do you have the appropriate administrative risk management systems and controls into place? Again, you may get to a point where if you're growing, you have internal accounting personnel that need to grow along with you, and that could maybe you started out just completely contracting everything out to a bookkeeper or an accountant, and that's fine. But you may get to a point with your company where you're growing and you need to add additional personnel and have people that can produce these type of accounting reports for your surety company. Next slide, Jody. So then also your contract review, that's a big part of, managing risk, is making sure you're not signing on to onerous contracts. It's interesting because I worked with contractors for many years, and the one thing contractors never forget is that one job that they did where they maybe lost money or had a really tough time with a contract. Even if it happened 20 years ago, they'll still remember it and they'll still bring it up. And so know your contracts and have a process in place for reviewing those as part of a broader risk management strategy within your company. And that may involve including, your internal personnel. Again, if you're growing, you may need someone at some point to start assuming some of this management of risk for your company. And it should involve your insurance broker. They should be able to help you at minimum review the insurance, indemnity, and bonding sections of those contracts. But making sure you're not signing on to tough contracts would be a big piece of growing that company. The larger the projects and the more projects you're taking on, the more risk you're taking on. And risk comes in a lot of forms. Certainly there's a ton of risks out there and exposures beyond just your contract, but your contract has risks in it too. And so there should be a formal process for going through and maybe identifying some of those. And that could be anything from, your project schedules and There could be risk involved in that if you're dependent upon an ice road to get supplies in, and now all of a sudden the project was delayed and it's springtime and you can no longer use that road and you have to hire a C-130 to freight in the stuff. That could have a tremendous impact on it. So a lot of that has a bearing on what you're doing there, and that's an area that you need to grow as your business grows. The next one is the project selection. Again, that's something that, in the beginning, you might be chasing revenue at every turn, and that's understandable. But as you grow and as you become bigger, you have to be careful with your project selection and pick the right projects to bid, pick the projects that are consistent with your strategic goals and objectives. It's always tough when you have somebody who they have a track record of, we've done this type of work for 10 years, 20 years. Now all of a sudden we're wanting to change gears and go into this completely different type of work. And so there's a lot that goes into that beyond that. So your project selection is an important part of your growing and who you have involved in that at your company. You can go to the next slide, Jody. And the same with your bidding and estimating. In the beginning, if you have a new contractor or a smaller contractor, you might see a case where the owner or maybe his general manager does all the bidding and estimating. But as you grow, as additional projects are put out there, you might have more personnel you need to bring in on that process. You might need to have more formal processes for reviewing these projects and for putting together your bids and estimating. So that's just another area that as you grow, you need to be aware of, making sure that you have the adequate personnel and resources in place to be able to pursue larger projects in terms of growing your bonding. Next slide, Jody. Okay, then goes to have I developed. We're still talking about what systems are necessary as part of this growth. And again, this all ties into being able to expand your bonding capacity and get a bonding program that's consistent with your company's strategic goals. Logistics, I just talked a little bit about that, but obviously there might be some additional considerations when we look at logistics if you are a bigger company than if you're a smaller company. So as your company grows, those are some of the things you need to think about. Maybe you are pursuing projects in a different geographical region than what you might have before. I know I heard a story, there was an excavator in New Mexico, and he spent his whole career excavating in like the east side of the state, and it was always sand, and he knew his prices and his margins, and he would bid work and get work, and it would be profitable. But then he would move to the west side of the state and tried to do some work over there, and what he ran into over there was a different type of ground. It was a lot rockier, and it took a lot longer to get through some of it. There might have been some blasting that had to happen, and that all drove its costs through the roof. And so, anytime you deviate from what you're accustomed to, you always have to think about those kind of added risks that you may not be aware of. And the logistics, that could be everything from, if you're an Alaskan contractor and now you're wanting to look at doing work in, Washington State or in Guam or in Colorado, all of these things. Now you may have different material suppliers you have to use. You might have a different crop of subcontractors. You may have to deal with the logistics involved of getting personnel into those places. So the logistics can change, and some of those systems have to grow as your company does. Again, consistent with your vision and your goals and objectives for what the company is. Next slide, Jody. Again, that's manpower. I talked a little bit about that. Next slide. Equipment, same thing there. These are all considerations that you have to keep in mind as your company grows. Material suppliers, talked a little bit about that. The next one, Jody. Subcontractors, that's a big one. If you're doing work in Alaska, and chances are, and if you use subcontractors, you probably have some relationships there that get built over time, and a lot of subcontractors have preferred generals that they work with and vice versa. And then now if you're going into a different area, or if maybe you're just taking on a larger workload, you may have to engage subcontractors outside of your normal realm of guys that you're comfortable working with. And so that's a consideration. If I get bigger, are my subcontractors prepared to also grow and be on multiple jobs as well? Or do I have to go out and engage new, take bids from different people, and then that may impact my calculation on how I'm going to manage that risk if I'm working with a new subcontractor versus a guy that I've been used to working with for 20 years. Next slide. And then the quality control aspect of all of it. Maybe you were really good at providing a really good product when you were doing, $5 million in revenue a year, but now you're doing $50 million in revenue, and you have different personnel, different suppliers, different subs. And sometimes some of those things can impact the overall quality control on a job. And so what do I as a business owner do to help manage some of those different risks? Next slide. Safety and regulatory issues. Sometimes if a project is bigger than what you're accustomed to, or if you're growing, sometimes these kind of things can sometimes fall by the wayside. There could be, safety concerns. Maybe you're one guy who you had in charge of safety management, your safety engineer, isn't enough now that you're doing, 5 projects simultaneously. And so you have to look at, okay, maybe we need to boost up that safety element to it. As everyone knows, safety is huge in construction. We want guys working safe, and we want them to go home to their families at night. So we always want to put a lot of emphasis on that, but and always be reevaluating it. Make sure the resources that you're dedicating towards safety are consistent with what you're doing. And then, of course, regulatory issues. Those could be too. Again, if you expand into a new area, you may have completely different sets of regulations and restrictions than what you're accustomed to. So those are things to keep in mind as well. Next slide, Jody. All right. Improperly planned for growth is worse than not growing. And that's really true. There's a lot of reasons why things that can go sideways on you when you're growing your business, when you're trying to grow a surety program, when you're trying to increase your revenues and profits. But not properly planning for that growth is certainly a mistake, and probably an area where we've seen more attention can be given to, some of the planning facets of this. You may be unable to put together a quality and safe labor force. So now instead of your 25-man crew that's really good and really safe, now you have 4 25-man crews, and maybe some of those people that are involved are not as safe and not as qualified as your regular guys. And so you may have all the intention in the world of expanding, but some of these things have to go along with it to make that happen. And again, the most important thing is just to have these things under consideration. None of this, what you're seeing, is going to be a blueprint specifically for your company. There's no substitute for going out and meeting with your broker, with your CPA, with your banker, and having these guys aware of what your plans are and how they can help you grow. This is more or less just to kind of touch on some of the things that are considerations from my point of view as a surety broker and the surety underwriter. And just to qualify what that means, as a surety broker, your surety broker is representing you. So they should be working with you hand in hand to put these kind of things together. And then the surety underwriter is a representative of the bonding company. Most brokers work with anywhere from 5 to 10 surety companies here in Alaska. I know that's the case with us. We probably have about 8 of them that we use, and a lot of them have very similar underwriting in certain areas, but sometimes they have different caveats, or there may be different reasons why we would place business with a specific surety company. Could be something as simple as one bonding company doesn't like design build jobs, and so they don't get excited about that. So maybe this design build contractor is a better fit for a different bonding company. But yeah, work with your brokers and everybody on that. Next slide, Jody. Personnel is inadequately trained on new equipment, and this could get into kind of doing different scopes of work than what you're normally used to. If you're used to doing vertical construction and building buildings, and now you're wanting to pave roads, there could be different considerations there, including equipment that you may have to either bring in new personnel for, or you may have to train people on. So that's a consideration. If you're growing and you're looking to take on additional scopes of work, do you have the resources to be able to actually do that and make that happen in a safe and profitable way? Next slide, Jody. Equipment resources are spread too thin. That, again, could be a product of when you're growing. Do I have enough equipment to make these jobs happen to support the growth that I want? And if I don't, can I get it? Can I get it in a costly manner? Next slide, Jody. Your banker is an important piece of your growth too, because they've got access to capital in a lot of cases. And if you're growing, in a lot of cases, you need access to that capital. Debt isn't bad by itself, but, you know, there's obviously, it can get out of control, but maintaining, you know, some debt and using financing where you can to take care of projects is something that happens on a daily basis. And so having a relationship with your banker and having them know what your plans are and what your intentions are can be an important piece to that. You could have all the willingness to try to grow in the world and get an established bonding program and make it bigger, but if your banker's not going to support you, if your CPA is not going to support you, if your bonding company is not going to support you, all the aspirations in the world aren't going to make those things happen. So these are people in your inner circle that should be part of your conversation and part of your strategic planning. Next slide, Jody. There's your new subcontracting partner. I know it kind of seems like a joke, but this kind of thing can actually happen. And believe me, over 26 years, I've heard some nightmare stories about use of subcontractors, whether it's just performing poorly or maybe your subcontractor just doesn't have the capital that they need to have. Maybe they're an unsafe subcontractor. You know, most of your established general contractors who are going to use subcontractors have a formal process in place for pre-qualifying those subcontractors. They're not going to just sign up anybody to do it. And that pre-qualification can take a number of different forms. You may want to ask the subcontractor for financial statements to make sure that they're fiscally stable and they're not going to go default in the middle of your job. You might want to know what other work program your subcontractor is running, because if they get short on resources, materials, manpower, you don't want to see all those guys over on a different job that's not yours, and while your job is at a standstill because that subcontractor doesn't have adequate personnel. So subcontractor safety is a big one. You know, a lot of times the general contractors will want to see subcontractor loss runs or EMOD ratings or other. It could include OSHA 300 logs and other things as part of that pre-qualification process to make sure they're not bringing someone on their job site that is going to cause problems and operate in an unsafe manner. You know, anytime there's an adverse thing that happens on a project, particularly if it ever involves, you know, bodily injury or things go sideways, even if the subcontractor caused it, the general contractor is going to be the one whose reputation is going to potentially take a hit by having these unsafe people and an adverse effect on there. And so there's a lot of ways that having a poorly performing subcontractor can impact you, but the main thing is just to make sure that you have a pre-qualification process where you can make sure that you're working with qualified people. Next slide, Jody. This is your main estimator after a 20% bid spread. Nobody likes leaving money on the table, and in some cases, if you do that, you may have to justify it to your bonding company with a bid spread letter and copies of your takeoff and your cost breakdown, materials, profits, sub costs. Because if there's a big bid spread, then, number one, there could be a legitimate reason for it. Perhaps you are local in the area where the job's being done and everyone else who's bidding it has a lot of added, overhead expenses and travel and logistic expenses that you wouldn't have. And so, there's a potential that certainly a bid spread could happen for a legitimate reason, but it's also sometimes an indicator that, there may have been something as innocent as mathematical errors done in the bid, or it could be something that, someone was really just trying to buy a job. And, when the economy gets tight and people want to keep their work crews going, we definitely saw cases of good-sized contractors, in some case, almost bidding the work at cost just to keep guys busy. Now, that's not a long-term strategy. Obviously, nobody's going to stay in business if you're not making money over the long term. But certainly you could, for a project or two, bid it pretty tight if you need to keep a crew busy and you had additional strategies and plans down the road for that. But this is another area where if you're growing, again, the bidding and estimating piece has to come with it. And if because of your growth, you have to bring an inexperienced guy in and he's setting you up in these bid spreads or leaving money on the table, and you get into the job and realize, boy, there's some problems with where we're at with this, that's another piece of it. Probably 80% of bond claims that come in on these contracts are on the payment bond. They're typically not on the performance bond. I mean, it does happen where someone may not be able to finish a job for whatever reason. Could be the death of an owner, it could be loss of key personnel, it could be, just a number of things. But most of the bond claims come in on the payment bond because a general contractor did not pay a material supplier, did not pay a subcontractor, and did not pay someone, and they filed on the bond. And a lot of times when we do see that, you backtrack to that original bid and you see that they left money on the table and underestimated on their initial bid to where they really didn't have a chance to make money on that contract from day one, regardless of how they did it out. So next slide, Jody. Yeah, and another thing too to keep in mind is obviously your margins may differ based on the different size projects you're bidding. If you are bidding $100,000 dirt work projects in the Matsu Valley, you're going to have a pretty thin margin because there's a bunch of guys who do that. There's guys who are local who do that, and there's guys who don't have a lot of overhead, and so look at your model. If that's your model to do dirt work in the Matsu Valley, then you have to accept that your margins are going to be a lot tighter. I have other guys I had a HVAC contractor who he was a real small operation. He would only keep a couple guys full time, but he specialized in remote bush work out in Western Alaska. And so he'd go out and do that, and he had his own plane. So he and his couple guys would fly out there in his own plane, and he'd spend the summer out there doing, 3 or 4 schools. And he was making, 40% margins on some of this stuff. And so, it depends. And then obviously as your project size grows, that may impact your margins. It may put you into bidding work against a completely different classification of competitors. If I'm bidding at 500,000, I'm bidding against one group of guys for the most part, whereas at 50 million, that would be a different group of people I'm bidding against. And so knowing what the margins are and where they're coming from and what your margin plans as you grow and as project size may grow is an important piece of this too. Go ahead, next one, Jody. Okay. Growth is the most vulnerable time for a contractor, and it's where more defaults and failures occur by all industry standards and reportings. And bonding companies know this, and most contractors know this. And it's not just true for contracting, it's really with almost any business. Anytime you're growing, you're stepping out of a model that you've been consistent with and you're looking at growing. So there's a lot of those pieces that have to come together like we had talked about. Next slide, Jody. There you go. Surety companies know and understand this. As a typical rule of thumb, most bonding underwriters are open to looking at projects 2 times your largest prior project. So if I got a guy who's doing $500,000 contracts and then $1 million one comes up, that's within the range of something we can look at. But if I have somebody who's consistently doing $500,000 projects and that's the biggest they've done, and now all of a sudden they want to leap from a $500,000 contract to a $5 million contract, that's a big leap. That's like a 400% increase. And there's a lot of things that have to go into place for that. Now, all of a sudden, what are we going to do? We're going to add added personnel, added considerations that we've talked about earlier. And so, keep that in mind, that if you are in a growth mode and truthfully, everyone wants to grow and everyone wants to be able to be profitable at what they're doing. It's just, you have to be aware that while you're growing, these things have to come into place. You can see there the numbers say between 13 and 15% of contractors fail in an average year. And during economic downswings, it can be 20%. It's maybe right. It's right there with restaurants. It's probably one of the riskiest businesses to be in, believe it or not. I mean, all contractors on some level are, I don't want to say gamblers, but you're definitely taking risk, and your objective is to turn that risk and those opportunities into profit. We can't sit home and take no risks and not try to grow anything, because you'll never go anywhere. But keep that in mind, that contracting is a risky business, and it's risky when you're growing. And so that's why we talk about all these other systems and things that you have to bring along in place. The bonding companies know that too. So as you grow, they're going to act as a check and balance against overexpansion. They're gonna not support that $5 million leap from 500,000. They're gonna have a conversation and say, maybe we want you to do $1 million job or $1.5 million job, and then we'll slowly, gradually over time build that up. There's no substitute for the relationship aspect. The longer you're with a surety and you can build this relationship, and the more they become familiar with you and your operations and have that assurance that you guys know what you're doing and you're doing this, the more they're going to work with you and be a partner for you in growing this. But they're also going to act as a check and balance against overexpansion, because they know this is the time where a lot of contractors fail, is when they take on too much. Next slide, Jody. So small businesses have the highest failure rate, while medium-sized have the lowest. The most vulnerable time for a contracting operation is when they have fewer than 20 employees, which is representative of a lot of startup businesses and small and medium-sized businesses. There's a lot of contracting operations in Alaska with 10 or fewer employees. A lot of the work gets subcontracted out, so you don't have a lot of people on the W-2, but just keep that in mind, that that's again speaks to some of the risks that a small and growing contractor might have to face in that. Next slide. So real quick, I mean, this is important to know, the top 5 reasons for failure in contracting. And we don't just put these up there because we think it's a cool list and here you go. This kind of stuff should be taken into consideration because these are things your surety underwriters are going to know, and they're going to have an impact on your underwriting. So number 1 is overexpansion or a flawed strategy. And that goes back to everything we've talked about so far with not just wanting to grow your bonding program and grow your company, but actually having to put all the pieces in place along the way that support that growth. So overexpansion causes failure, and as does flawed strategies. Pursuing things based on bad information or wishful thinking as opposed to really grounding those kind of decisions in reality and enlisting everybody that you can to help you with that. Next slide. Volume obsession. I always have to, I chuckle when people talk about how much revenue they're doing, because it doesn't really matter if you're in contracting or any other business. The revenue is just a number. It doesn't mean anything. I've seen contractors do $1 million in revenue and be a lot more profitable than another contractor who did 10 million in revenue. And so having a volume obsession is not a good idea, especially if you're new or if you're growing your bonding and you have capacity considerations. If you're a new contractor or you've been around for a few years and maybe you are looking at bidding bigger work, you shouldn't obsess obviously on the revenue figure. It's the net income at the end of the day that makes a difference. And if you only have a limited amount of bonding, how are you going to use that capacity? If I'm a guy and if my bonding company will support me on $500,000 worth of work, 500,000 at a time, or let's say 5 million, let's say they'll give me 5 million. I have to be careful about what I'm doing with that 5 million, because if I bid a job and I get it, but I have a 1% profit margin in it and it's tying up all my bonding capacity, meanwhile I'm watching all these other jobs go by that I can't bid because all of my bonding capacity is tied up, then that may be a consideration. So don't worry about the volume obsession. The idea here at the end of the day is to be profitable for the shareholders, for the company, for the people that work there. And next slide. Poor project selection. Again, this kind of goes back to that. And it can tie back to my prior point about your bonding capacity. If you bid a job for, let's say you're a subcontractor on a job and you have to post bonds, and you post those bonds in February, but the project isn't starting until your portion of the work ain't going to be done till September. And now you're having to post and tie up bonding capacity in February. That's not even going to be a consideration till September. And so that may not be the wisest decision to make, just because, you're going to miss other opportunities. And so you have to be really savvy about what projects you're taking on, what projects you're pursuing, what the scope of work is. Make sure your risk management and your insurance is a piece of that. As a general rule of thumb, I say that a lot of times to avoid the one-offs. And what that means is that if you're building, let's say you're doing dirt work and trailhead construction, and now a project comes along for building demolition that you want to bid. Well, that has a whole bunch of other considerations involved. You're going to have to revamp your insurance program. You're going to have to carry different things there. And then you get this one job and it's done, and now you want to, go back to your comfort zone. But that can be costly to do those one-offs in a lot of different ways. It can be costly from a safety perspective. It can be a costly financial move. So have a process in place for project selection, and pay particular attention if you're really looking at stuff that's stepping out of your comfort zone. And the bonding company will as well. I mean, if you're doing commercial tenant improvements and the bonding company loves you and they support all the bonding you want doing commercial tenant improvements, and now you come to them and you're going to be putting up radio towers, they're going to have some questions for you about that. It's not just a matter of, well, I can get this much bonding no matter what I'm doing. They're going to have questions. So keep that in mind. That's another main reason for contractors failing is just a poor project selection. Next slide, Jody. Insufficient capital and profitability. There's a lot of reasons why it can be tough to grow a surety program, but one of the most frequent ones is just wanting a program that's beyond your financial means in terms of capital and profitability. We'll talk a little bit. I got a couple other slides where we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, but that is a reason for failure. Obviously, if you don't have insufficient capital and you're not profitable, you're not going to stay in business for long. Nonprofit construction companies don't tend to stick around. Go ahead, next slide, Jody. Poor business acumen, and God bless everybody in their efforts to generate revenues and to grow their companies. And we have a real entrepreneurial spirit here in the United States, which is awesome. I love the fact that people can take something that they want to do and make it happen. And it's not that way everywhere. I've had some conversations with friends who are business advisors in Europe, and they always say to me, they say, well, in America, you can just start anything you want and make it grow. In Europe, you can't do that. You have to go to like classes and do other stuff and stuff like that. And so for better or worse, our spirit of allowing opportunity and freedom for people to pursue things is beautiful and wonderful on many levels, but sometimes you can end up with, a person who's not the most qualified person to be making some of these decisions, and they may make bad business decisions sometimes. And, a business is impacted by those decisions that owners and managers make. They can only do that so many times before it's going to lead to a failure of the company. So poor business acumen, reason number 5, why construction companies fail. Next slide, Jody. Okay, so the key is to define and plan for growth and get buy-in from all the necessary parties. Next slide. If anybody, too, just as a reminder, has any questions or anything along the way, you're welcome to type them in there to the chat, and we'll be happy to address any of them. And when we get to the end here of the presentation, I'll also be happy to open it up for any questions. And as a follow-up item, if anybody wants to get a hold of me, you're welcome to do that. Jody and Ptac have my contact information, and we're always willing to share information with folks on that kind of thing. So obviously, your surety is your key partner, because without this surety company, I can't go out and pursue anything over $100,000 in the government sector. So making sure that we have a good relationship with that surety company is an important piece of this. And it goes to the same principles that are involved with any relationship, whether it's your boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, spouse, or anybody else. There's some basic principles and things that you have to bring to the table to have this relationship and make it be successful. Next slide, Jody. Your banker, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but again, if you need access to capital, to lines of credit, while I'm on that topic, every surety company looks favorably upon having a line of credit. But having a line of credit that's not used up or largely tapped out, if you have a line of credit available and you go into a project and something goes sideways, in most cases, money can fix almost anything. You can hire a different guy, you can bring someone else in. It might be painful, but you may have you have the financial ability to deal with some of these adverse things. Your lead bidder puts you into a situation where you're losing money, and now you've got issues paying material suppliers. If you have a line of credit, you could step in, solve that problem, and deal with it another day. But so your banker is an important person to have a good relationship with. Next slide, Jody. Your accountant, your CPA. Again, there's some awesome, really super high qualified CPAs around Alaska that know construction, and those guys can really be invaluable. And their value goes a lot further than just providing you with a CPA reviewed financial statement. If you're looking to pursue the type of workloads we talked about before, $1.5 million or higher, you're going to need to get a CPA review done at some point in time. And having an accountant do that for you or a CPA do that for you is going to be a good piece of that puzzle. But there's also a lot of other areas that they can help you with. They can help you with analysis of the financial statements. They can help you with cash flow projections and analysis. They can help you with your WIP schedules and a lot of other things. So again, all these people are important pieces of this puzzle if you're trying to grow your bonding program and you want to have something that supports what your strategic goals and objectives are. Next slide, Jody. Your insurance broker. And there may be cases where this guy is the same person as your surety person, and then there may be other cases where it's not. There may be cases where you have different brokerages that you use over these. But in any event, this insurance broker's an important piece of the puzzle because he's the guy you're sending your contracts to look those over. Make sure that, number one, you're complying with all the insurance requirements that the owners have put forth. And if you're not, to get you in compliance with whatever that is, they should be able to give you estimates on costs for compliance with the provisions prior to your bid. So even before bidding this stuff, if you're not properly accounting for some of these insurance costs in there, I had a guy come into my office one day and he had a big smile on his face and he dropped a contract on my desk and said, "Hey, I just signed this contract. I'm really happy. This is going to be a great job." It wasn't a big job, but it's going to be a good job for him. And then we start going through the insurance requirements, and there's $16,000 of added insurance expense in there between, pollution policies and other things in there. And the guy probably only had that amount built into his profit margin. So now he's dropping a contract on my desk where he's going to make no money. So having your insurance broker be able to review those things, and also having your insurance broker be able to help consult you on how you should be handling your subcontractors. If you utilize subcontractors, what your contract should say, what those should require, what provisions you have to flow down from the general. And then that insurance broker can also usually provide you with just another level of risk management support and help, whether it be, safety issues or HR issues or other things. So that's another guy on your team that's an important piece of this. Next slide, Jody. Attorney. Nobody likes to fork out money for legal situations. But we live in a litigious society, and I always joke and say one nation under litigation, because it really seems that way sometimes, where basically anybody's going to sue anyone for a lot of different things, and that person who sues you may be someone you never in a million years would have expected to bring a suit against you. But when money's involved and business relationships are involved, things like that happen, and that's where you have to have a good relationship with your attorney. And that relationship may vary depending on what your needs are. That attorney may review your contracts for you, may help craft your contracts, and may help you with leases and other legal documents. But he's another good part of the puzzle. So those 5 people right there, that's your team. That's who's going to help you grow your bonding capacity. That's who's going to help you stay in business and go forward. Next slide, Jody. Okay, next one. All right, so we'll talk about some of the keys to growing the bonding capacity. It must be an organizational-wide commitment to take the necessary steps to support your bonding capacity growth. If you have 2 owners and one owner wants bigger projects, wants to grow the revenues, wants to grow the profits, wants to grow the bonding program, but the other owner is not aligned with that same philosophy and isn't willing to take on those same level of risks, that can obviously cause issues there. And so this is really where it's kind of the short answer here is you got to be on the same page. So if we have a strategic goal and vision for the company and everyone is on board with it, that's great. That's the first step, and that's what you got to have. You also have to be committed to providing accurate, transparent, and timely information and documentation to the surety company. This goes back to that relationship. If a surety company asks for information, asks for documentation, you're going to want to provide that to them. You're going to want that information to be accurate. You're not going to want to provide them financial statements that don't paint an accurate picture, or they give off red flags because there's things wrong with them. So you want that information you give them to be accurate. You're going to have to commit to transparency. This bonding company is going to know everything about your company. They're going to know all about your financials, your key personnel, your capabilities. Sooner or later, they're going to be just like a family member, basically. They're going to have a pulse on what your company's doing, and that enables them to be in the best position to try to help you too. So that maybe if you have to make a case that, hey, here's a good job and here's why we think it's good and here's why we want to pursue this and bond this, that you have that level of credibility with a bonding company that you know what you're doing. You always provide truthful and accurate information. And then the third piece is timely information, which is a big one. If you're trying to bid work and you're scrambling around to try to get financial statements together or WIP schedules or bank lines of credit and other things, that can be problematic. And so if the companies ask for documentation, it's important that you have the systems in place to be able to provide that to them in a timely, accurate, and transparent manner. Establish, maintain a formal business line of credit if appropriate. We talked a little bit about that before, and that's really beneficial. Now, there's some, and we can talk a little bit about what I call creative surety underwriting. There may be cases where contractors want to bid work and really feel strongly about pursuing the job, but they can't get a buy-in through standard underwriting. And so sometimes there's different things that we can do and that the bonding company can do that can still make that happen, even if some of the things aren't necessarily in place to have it approved through a standard thing. And one of those is like the SBA program. The SBA has a surety guarantee program where if you get it set up, the SBA will come in and they'll back 70 or 80% of the bond, which lowers the risk to the surety company and allows the surety company maybe to extend capacity that they might not normally do. Now, there's some project size limitations on the SBA program. I think it's 10 million and some other considerations there. There's some fees involved there. Usually the surety company will help offset any SBA fees by adjusting premium in some cases. But so just, making sure that one of the things about the SBA program is that they treat a line of credit as good as cash. So if you have an open line of credit that's available, when they do their underwriting and they're calculating out what your current assets are and what your current liabilities are and what your working capital is, that line of credit gets factored in there as good as cash. So obviously that can have a big impact on your financial ratios if they're including that in there as cash. So having a line of credit is definitely seen as a favorable tool by bonding underwriters. And then must be committed to the accounting systems and controls that support the type of surety capacity being pursued. This again goes back to one of the biggest problems we have is not being able to provide the level of assurance on financial statements that bonding companies want to have. You do $500,000 jobs all summer long, you're doing $500,000 jobs and you're not having to provide financial statements, and now a one-off comes along, a $2 million job, and the size of the job may not be a disqualifier in itself, but the fact that you can't produce the financial statements in a credible manner to the bonding company could be a consideration. So, and that's again where the one-offs are kind of a really tough thing. You know, you could have somebody doing $1 million jobs and they're doing in-house financials, and then that one-off comes along that's, $3 million, and they want to do that. They want the $3 million bonding, but they don't want to do the things necessary to make that happen. They don't want to incur the expense. They don't want to pay their CPA $10,000 or $15,000 to do a CPA review, but they still want the bigger bonding program, and that can be the hardest situation to work with, because it's, getting more bonding isn't just a matter of want and desire. Things have to be in place, and doing those one-offs like that can be really hard because you've set the company up a certain way to support a certain size project, and now you're stepping out of all that and you want something much bigger. Next slide, Jody. Keep your business plans updated and advisors on any changes that you have, and update to your business plans. If you're bidding, $200,000 projects, it's probably not as critical to keep that surety underwriter tied into your day-to-day and your business plans. But certainly if you're bidding $1 million or more projects and you got all that, or if you're approaching a new surety company, maybe you're either changing bonding companies for whatever reason, or maybe you're just starting out and you're looking to establish a bonding program. Having them aware of what you're doing is important, even so much that it just conveys to the bonding underwriters that you have a plan. A lot of on a bigger contract operation, we may share with the bonding underwriters, resumes and business plans and strategic goals and those kind of things. But even on a smaller level, if I've got a guy who doesn't maybe have some of all those things in place, we'll usually recommend, look, you got to give me a page or two of what your strategic goals are, what the types of plans or projects you're looking to pursue, project size, project location. I got to have something to bring to the bonding company that shows the bonding company that you've put thought into this and that there is a strategic plan in place and this is where you're going. Those kind of things can be important, and they can also be an asset and assist you with some of that stuff along the way. Have your resumes for key personnel, your prior project history and letters of reference on file. Those are always good, especially if you're just looking to get a program set up, or if you're looking to move bonding companies. Having those kind of things can really be helpful in helping the bonding company understand who your company is. Because when you think about it, when we're submitting bond submissions into the surety underwriters, we're just giving them paper. They've got pieces of paper and there's information on that paper. But some of these other things like resumes and prior project history and letters of reference, these are the kind of things that can really make your company come alive and really help the surety company understand who it is they're working with. And so those are all beneficial if you have those kind of things around. Discuss major financial decisions with the surety ahead of time. And this is important because I've seen this play out in a not positive manner for contractors. If you've got owners that are taking all the money out of the company, you're not leaving any capital in there, bare minimums, and the owner has 4 houses and a Learjet, and your company has nothing in it, that's going to obviously have an impact on what the surety company thinks of writing bonds for you. Why would the bonding company want to stand behind your company and support you when you as the owner aren't even doing it yourself because you're pulling all the money out of the company and you have no commitment to growth? So that's an important piece of it. And then the capital expenditures, every dollar you have in your account is part of the underwriting process when you submit a bond request. And when you do things like go out and buy a whole new fleet of dump trucks, or you go out and purchase 3 new excavators, these are all things that are taking away your liquidity. And that, therefore, is going to have a very direct impact on what your working capital ratios are and what your liquid assets are that are available. And so I've seen cases of contractors who, had a $5 million bonding program, and then they go out and spend all this money and can literally almost get next to nothing because they put the company in a financial position of being almost unbondable. And so every time you do capital expenditures, if you buy new equipment, new vehicles, if you buy property, all of these things that are going to remove cash from your liquidity, and they'll give you the fixed asset. You'll have it. In some cases, it'll be depreciated out over time. But these are all important decisions that can affect your financial ratios and your bondability. So I recommend before you do these kind of things, before the owner takes a huge bonus, before the owner or the manager just go out and buy a bunch of new equipment, that you talk to your bonding company ahead of time. What are going to be the implications if I do A, B, and C? So again, having that relationship. And then the last point on here is a commitment to responsible estimating and bidding and showing a good project selection. If you're constantly walking the surety company into bid spreads, and that could be an issue. Bonding companies want to do business with construction companies that make money. I mean, that's all there is to it. Nonprofit contracting operations don't last long. And so having responsible estimating and bidding and being able to show good project selection to a bonding company is a good idea. You can here's an example. Let's say you're working in Alaska and you're always doing these jobs, and now something comes up in Antarctica and you want to bid that. Even the act of you inquiring about doing something like that may speak to the bonding company. It may give them an impression that, okay, this person is really shooting off the hip and doesn't really have a firm sense of who they are, what they're doing, and where they're at. And maybe the Antarctica project makes sense. I don't know. But just hypothetically speaking, these are important things to keep in mind. Next slide, Jody. Commit to a financial management philosophy that supports the desired bond growth. You've got to have liquidity and money in your account. That's one of the many financial ratios and things that's looked at. What's your working capital, your current assets minus your current liabilities. And then that number is going to be somewhat relative to what type of bonding program you're talking to. And so if you do $500,000 jobs and you take all the money out of your company and don't really leave any in there, then that model could be fine. There could be nothing wrong with that. But if you are doing $5 to $10 million jobs, $20 million jobs, and you're still not showing growth in equity over time and having the liquidity available, then it's not going to support the type of bonding program that you want or need. And so how you manage the finances of your company can have a big impact on what kind of bond program you have, and vice versa. What kind of bond program you have could depend on how you manage your finances. So those two are intertwined. Next slide. So what does that mean? Next slide. We talked a little bit about this, but reinvesting in the company and building equity and working capital, especially as you develop this relationship with the bonding company over time. A bonding company might not be worried about you being really tight margins for, a year. But if you start putting together a 5-year track record, a 10-year track record of some of these things where you're not building equity and you're not reinvesting in your company, that could become an issue. Having liquid cash flow or access to liquid cash flow, that again goes back to lines of credit, things along those lines, maintaining liquidity in the company, having the appropriate accounting systems and controls in place. We've talked a little bit about that. Frequent review of your financial performance and standing. So as owners, you're going to be a lot more dialed in on the financial condition of the company if you're pursuing $20 million jobs than you would be if maybe you're just pursuing $100,000 jobs. You might not have the same level of oversight there. Maintaining manageable debt with favorable terms. Like I said earlier, all debt's not bad. Obviously, is bad debt, but not all debt is bad. And it's all a numbers game. Work with your accountant, make sure you're getting the best terms possible on that. Anything you can allocate from a short-term liability to a long-term liability could have impacts on your working capital ratios. So there's sometimes some debt that can be reorganized or shuffled around, and that's something you'd look at in connection with your accountant and your bonding broker. Evaluating the long-term and fixed assets for return on investment, disciplined bidding with appropriate margins. These are all things that build into that financial management philosophy. And if you're growing your company, you know, these things might not matter as much today, but if you're going to grow, they may matter where you're going. So keep those in mind. Next slide.
So Chris, I'm going to pop in. We just got a question on that. What do sureties feel is an appropriate margin? Let me expand that question so I can get the whole question for you.
Well, so I mean, I'm assuming we're talking about the actual profit margins on contracts, or are we talking about the working capital margin or relationship?
So the second part of that question is, he was asking, what do sureties feel is an appropriate margin? Do they only look at gross, net, or both? And do you need some more?
No. That's good. And I mean, I think probably that's largely dictated by best practices. You know, most of these surety companies have a lot of benchmark data that they use. And in a lot of cases, that benchmark data is used against yourself. So they may have you plugged into their program where they're tracking your margins over time, and they're comparing, okay, this year versus this year versus this year. So they're benchmarking. I mean, I don't know that there's a hard number because it really depends on the type of work you're doing. Like, you know, heavy civil may have a tighter margin than renovation, remodel. Different surety companies may have a little bit of a different philosophy. So it'd be hard for me to just say, you know, here's a solid pinpoint thing, you know, 10%. We want to see 10% margins on everything. Or, you know, because if you're doing much larger projects, those margins may be 3%. And so that just depends a little bit. I don't know if I know that's kind of an ambiguous answer, but I mean, it's a good question for sure. And one that I would recommend they honestly talk to their surety underwriter about and see if they have that, because usually they'll have benchmark material where my bonding underwriter can pull up and look and see what the average profit margin is for a mechanical contractor in the Pacific Northwest. They have that data. They can look and go, oh, okay, it's 3.8% or it's 7%. And so they'll benchmark a lot of that stuff. CFMA, which I mentioned earlier, which is a nonprofit trade association, Construction Financial Management Association. Every year they put out their benchmark stuff, and you know there's a cost to pay for it. Sometimes your CPA, if they're really versed in construction accounting, may have that stuff, but that has a lot of benchmark data in there that people might find interesting. It's a CFMA year-end benchmark survey, and they gather data from a lot of them. Now, that being said, sometimes your data from somewhere like Alaska may be a little bit more limited than other places, because obviously this requires participation and it's a numbers game, and they probably have a lot more of a sample size coming out of California than they would out of Alaska, which Alaska has some of its own unique things. And then the other thing too is obviously that margin can change a little bit over time from year to year, where, you know, maybe you're able to happily have, you know, 5% one year, but due to conditions and things that change sometimes, and maybe now you're lucky to get 3%. So again, it's a great question. And it's kind of, my answer is a little bit ambiguous, but mostly because it's a little bit of some variables involved there. And I would recommend they talk to their surety broker and their surety underwriter and see what kind of margins, you know, they're seeing for those same type of trades and locations.
Okay, so we're going to have a follow-up on that question. Same individual. I'd like to know, okay, what about debt ratios? What is a good range to try and manage? If a contractor is growing, they're going to likely be carrying a higher debt ratio versus a contractor being consistent.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think that's exactly right. And I think that's important too, where your surety and your key professionals that are on your team, your CPA, all your guys in your circle are aware of what you're doing. And I think that's important to be able to have that conversation about why is the debt ratios where they're at or how much debt there is, because there could be, there's very good reasons for having debt, and then there's not so good reasons for having debt. Most of those are identifiable, but having that conversation with your bonding company or with your underwriter and broker is probably very appropriate. And a lot of times it could make a difference if I just present, here's my debt ratio and my financials to the bonding company, and all they're seeing it on his paper, but they don't know the reason why. That could impact their underwriting. And so as a broker, my job is to communicate with my client and partner with them to go to the bonding company and have these conversations and talk to them about those, because there could be real good reasons. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but that question is also warrants a little bit of an ambiguous answer, because there's so many things that it really just depends on. I can't throw a firm number out like, okay, 3-to-1 or what have you is going to be your number that you want to be at, because it does make a difference on what is that debt. Is it just credit cards? The owner's wife wanted to go to Puerto Rico for 3 months and live on credit cards, or is this debt being incurred as part of our overall strategy to grow? And I think the bonding company would look at both of those debt situations in a different light, but ultimately the obligation is up to the broker and the contractor to help communicate that to the surety underwriter. So yeah, a little bit ambiguous, but also too, those are the kind of things that debt ratio is something that the sureties benchmark, and something that they also have in that CFMA benchmarking material that you can get. So I guess I apologize for not just giving a firm answer, but that is a good question too. Both very good questions, and they should be able to get answers for that from those guys for their specific situation. Next slide, reinvestment, next slide. So this is basically talking about leaving money in the company. Appropriately managed, a contractor can potentially get a 400% return investment on keeping cash profit in the company by using their surety program. And I'll explain that. Okay, so most of your surety companies want to see a certain percentage of cash on hand versus the size of the projects you're bidding, your working capital versus your aggregate bond program. There's a relationship there. That number for a lot of people is 10%. That number, though, could be different depending on a bonding company, depending on your relationship with them. But in the surety industry, a general rule of thumb in the underwriting process is you want to see 10% working capital to support the work program. So, for example, if a contractor wanted to pursue a $500,000 bonded project, the surety would want to see 50% in adjusted working capital, or basically 10% of that total bond size they want to see cash on hand. And when I say adjusted working capital, what I mean, without going too deep into financial concepts, is current assets, which is your cash and your accounts receivables in most cases, current assets minus your current liabilities, any debt you have due in the next 12 months. You take your current assets, you minus your current liabilities, that's going to give you a working capital figure. You can bond 10% of that as a general rule of thumb. Now, I say adjusted working capital because there's a lot of cases where, you can do your current assets minus your current liabilities and come up with a working capital figure. But if the bonding company runs it through their thing, that may be different. So, for example, let's say I'm showing $1 million in accounts receivables. I'm owed $1 million by my clients, but $500,000 of that is 300 days old on the aging report. The surety companies, when they look at the aging, they consider anything over 90 days to potentially be a problem, a hung receivable. It could be representing money that you as a contractor will never see, or maybe you'll see it, but you have to litigate and go through 3 years before you're ever going to get it. So if you have, so when you're calculating your working capital position, you're including all your accounts receivables, but the surety company is writing off those. They're not going to give you credit for this $500,000 hung receivable from 300 days ago. So their working capital is going to come out with a different figure than what yours is. So that's the only reason why I say adjusted working capital. But as a kind of a general rule of thumb, you know, if some guy calls me and says, hey, I want to bid a $5 million job, my right off the bat, I want to know, okay, do you have $500,000 in liquid assets in a working capital relationship? Because if you don't, then the chances of getting something like that done it's almost, you're probably not going to do it. So next slide, Jody, and this still will tie into the same concept. Okay, so essentially in a typical scenario, for each liquid dollar you have in your company, you can look at getting $10 in surety credit, right? There's your 10% ratio. Now, if you turn that surety credit over twice in a year, in other words, you bond a project, you finish the project, you move to the next project, you bond that project. Now that $1 of money sitting in your account has brought you $20 in surety credit, okay? Now, if you pull the 20% profit margin, which, you know, is just a hypothetical number for calculating this out, but now you have $4 in profit from that $20 in surety credit and that $1 you left in your company. So that initial $1 you had got you surety capacity that you then turned around and turned into $4, which is a 400% investment on keeping money in your company. And so, you know, if you want to have the kind of surety program that supports what you're looking to do, you have to be willing to invest in your company, leave the capital in there, and you can turn that capital and burn it. Now, you don't want to have just capital sitting around and doing nothing either. You have to make that money work for you. And so I get that. And we also get tax implications. You get to the end of the year and you got the accountant telling the contractor, you know, oh, you're showing, you know, too much money here. You know, we got to make these adjustments and show less money. Meanwhile, the bonding underwriter and the bonding broker want money shown. We got to have you showing money in there, or else we can't bond your project. So it's really kind of a back and forth and finding the right space where, you know, you don't have capital that isn't being used to create opportunities, but you also, and you don't want to pay more taxes than what you have to, but you also have to reinvest in your company. And that's one of the things that's different. If you're growing or building your bonding program, you're going to have to make a commitment to leave equity and leave money in the company. It's just the way it is. You can have this other model for 20 years where you never need bonding and never leave the money in there, but now you're moving to something different and you have to leave that in there. Next slide, Jody. So there's no substitute for individual and specific consultation from a surety broker, and that's kind of one of the points. This presentation offers, you know, some general ideas and concepts, but really each company is unique and different and should work with their surety professionals, a broker, and all their professionals, their CPA, their banker, their attorney, all these people who are part of their team. And then at that point, you really can get into, okay, they know my company and what specifically challenges we're dealing with, and here's where we want to go, and we have a plan to go there, and this is what we need. So I think is that the last slide, Jody?
It is.
Okay, and we're at 1:35, so I think I've done okay on time-wise. I'll just wrap it up real quick by saying I appreciate everyone tuning in. I always like to share information on this stuff. We always support Ptac and what they do. They're a great organization. If I have anybody who's new or going into government contracting, I send them over there. They put on educational things and other stuff. So thank you, Jody, and thank you to everyone who attended. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend.
So I have just a couple quick comments. First of all, I'd like to do a last call for questions. If anyone has any comments or questions they'd like to add, go ahead and just raise a hand. I'll be glad to unmute you or add your comments. And while you're thinking about that, I just want to add a couple things myself. The Small Business Development Center, Sbdc, is another great resource. They're one of the partner programs here at the university with Ptac, and we work closely with a lot of the business advisors. So if you're looking at some of these financial impacts and you're looking for more assistance in developing your accounting practices or being able to do those yourself or better understand them, Sbdc has a lot of great free and on-demand and live workshops, aksbdc.org, check out theirs, but also feel free to sign up as a Sbdc client and take advantage of those free one-on-one counseling sessions as well for those business advisors. The last thing to toot Sbdc's horn is they have a workshop that they do several times a year called Profit Mastery Workshop. It's a 2-day, it's a total of 16 hours. So they break it in different ways. And it is a larger dollar cost item, but I have taken that workshop. The Profit Mastery Workshop really helps you as a non-financial person. You know, finance, accounting isn't your region, your industry. Understand that cash flow and that value of money. And it really does tie back into a lot of the points that Chris brought up today on, yeah, your cash has to work for you, but at the same time, you have to have that cash on hand and, you know, moving your debt from long-term, short-term. So that Profit Mastery is a fabulous workshop for really understanding how to get the most use out of your liquid capital. And so if you tie that knowledge back in with the information Chris has provided today, it can really make you a much stronger, give you that better business acumen on use of your cash. So just wanted to throw that out there. So I don't see any last questions. So we can go ahead and close. Again, I want to really thank you, Chris. And again, your company is at Business Insurance Associates here. I know you didn't leave a phone number on your last slide, but you can just Google BIA, Business Insurance Associates, if you're looking for contact information for Chris, or feel free to reply to your webinar invite, ask your question, and I'll be more than happy to forward that on to Chris or provide you Chris's contact information. So at this point in time, I don't see any other questions, so I am going to go ahead and close today's webinar. So thank you for all the attendees that made it today. And Chris, thank you again so much for being here. Greatly appreciate it. It's amazing the information that you know.
Thank you.
All right,
Take care,
everyone. Stay safe, stay warm.